Record on the, all right. Oop, I'm just trying to close the participants. Okay. So, welcome. And my thank you so much for sticking it out through some really crazy, some really challenging technical difficulties. So, uh, what we're doing is this is Apna Ghar recording a live panel with the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. I'm Radhika Sharma Gordon, and I manage education and outreach at Apna Ghar. And since this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we are wanting to focus on the folks who are working at the root causes and working with those who have committed or are committing harm in their relationships, and to learn more, to be able to teach the public and inform the public about what abuse intervention looks like right now, give you an idea of some of the wonderful folks who are doing this incredible work, and then learn more from them about what their model is, how it works, and then you know, what they think works well about it, what needs to be changed, and then you know, what they think, what they recommend in terms of other models or other ways of approaching holding those who harm accountable, and also addressing their own healing while also building their capacity for empathy and all of the other social emotional learning that all of us need to be doing. So this is the beginning of a series. We will be doing other hopefully live recordings or live panels in the future, where we are going to talk to other folks who are engaging people who have committed harm in different ways. We've been learning about a wonderful array of models out there. There are people here in Chicago who are trying some different innovations, and we know about folks in California who've been doing some really important work with young people. And we know that there are some models from Canada that have been working, conducting abuse intervention groups in other languages. And we're wanting to, bring them on in the future and learn from them. So tonight, our inaugural session is going to be with the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. And I'm going to start, and with us tonight are Christine Call, Terry Pope, and Jim Harvey. And we're going to start out with Christine Call, the founder of the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. And she's going to talk about how this all got started and the folks that she's worked with to establish the center, and briefly describe how their partner abuse intervention program works. So thank you and welcome, Christine. And if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how the center got started.
Surely, I'd be happy to do that. Actually, I think that I should start with saying that, my interest and passion for doing this work and motivation really started from the time that I was the executive director at the Crisis Center for South Suburbia. And at that time, I often would sit in with the groups of women, support groups, and I would hear the women say, why aren't there services for men? Why isn't he getting any help? Why can't I, if he can change, why do I have to leave my home, and come to a shelter? And can it be safe for us to co-parent, even if I don't want to live with him? And so all of these questions just kept coming. And actually at the Crisis Center, we had one of the very first groups. It was one group for men who had harmed their intimate partner at that time. And that was in the mid 1980s. And there were actually 5 executive directors of the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence who were also saying, it's great, we need to have services for survivors and victims, but we're not gonna be able to really address intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, unless we work with the individuals who are perpetrating the harm. And so we started advocating for training. We started looking at what was going on in other states. We started, Dr. Richard Tolman was at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he was wanting to do some research, did some research at the Crisis Center. And so it just sort of evolved. I moved on from the Crisis Center to Sarah's Inn, was the executive director there, and started several groups there. And my co-founder, I'm actually not the sole founder, my co-founder, Dr. Charlie Stoops, and I were both in our doctoral program at the University of Illinois, and we're hearing from the EAP, Employee Assistance Program person at the university, that she had some people who had harmed their partner and there wasn't anywhere to refer them. Where was she going to send them? She couldn't find a place to send them. And it really started from there that we started actively talking to some of our victim service partners and asking, what should we do, getting input. And we actually worked collaboratively with Connections for Abused Women and Children, Haymarket Center, and the University of Illinois Department of Psychiatry in a collaboration where we started providing services for those who harmed at Haymarket Center in the Department of Psychiatry. And we did that for about 5 years. And then we incorporated in 2003 as a not-for-profit. And so we really had, I think it's just so important for everyone to know that we worked collaboratively with our victim service programs to develop our curriculum, to talk about how to do our groups, that we were not doing this in isolation. And we continue to do that. We're active members and connected with other victim service programs, and recognize that, whatever we do, we have to be doing it in collaboration and with a strong focus on safety of victims, survivors, and their children, that we always kind of recognize that, the other person, they may not be in the room when we're facilitating groups, when we're talking to people in our program, but we know they're there. And we're always recognizing that. So that's my quick but short story of how we got started, and really wanted to say it's the women. It was women who said, we want this, And while we know that, not everybody is going to change, and that there's a continuum of change, that some people will make, more changes than others. We know from the work we've done that we've seen some transformative changes in people as they've moved through the program. And we also know from some of the evidence-based research that is also the case. And I'm thinking that we probably want to hear from some other people besides me. So I think I answered your first question. Maybe you have another question for me, or you want to move on to Terry or Jim.
Well, you know what? I think it'd be great for us to hear from Terry and Jim about how they got connected with the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace, and then we'll have one of you sort of describe how, what the model looks like, when you explain to somebody what partner abuse intervention is, so after Terry and Jim get a chance to introduce themselves and their origin story with the center, then we'll open into describing the model. So Terry.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, well, good evening, everyone. And I'm so happy to be here to speak with you guys today regarding this very important work that we do. I started with Center for Advancing Domestic Peace about 7 or 8 years ago. I was working on my master's degree in counseling. I needed an internship, right? So it started out just with need. And just even during my interview, I had done a little research, so I knew some things, but not much, but the idea of partner abuse intervention was not on my horizon at all. We don't think about people who harm when we think about domestic violence. We just think about the victims and survivors, and look at ways that we can almost, it seems like, erase those who harm, like they don't need services, when in fact it's totally opposite. Why wouldn't we work with the person that harms so that we can kind of meet that challenge of eliminating domestic violence by meeting the persons or people who engage in that, right? And so that was fascinating to me. And so immediately I was immersed into the program in terms of, doing the group work, doing the assessments and intakes and just the whole body, and realizing that so many times that when we have our participants that are referred from, into the program, that we're often the first people that really get a chance to ask what happened, to hear their perspective, hear their sides of the story. Because most of the time in victim services, or when an incident occurs, it's like get the victim services, get the victim's help the victim. And so that person who is harmed ends up being arrested perhaps, or pushed out of the situation. And oftentimes, just in terms of just working with the clients, yes, they've engaged in some behaviors that are bad. But often, as I've come to learn, a lot of these behaviors are normalized, and realizing that it's not just physical harm, that it's emotional harm. And sometimes the emotional harm or the financial harm can be just as cutting as actually being physically harmed. So that was something that really kept me here, just really, really thinking about trying to change, just make a change, advocating for people who've harmed to change, encouraging, motivating them, and helping them to recognize that there are strengths here, and whether we're trying to build on these strengths. You have the ability to make the changes if you want to. So it's about finding that catalyst, but being a catalyst for change, and helping them to find out what it is that motivates them to change. So yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you. And
Yes.
Jim,
Thanks so much for this opportunity, and welcome everyone. My name is Jim Harvey, and I come from a background of public health, actually. And after retiring, after many years of working in community health for HRSA and for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, one of the things we began talking about very early on in that field was that violence, all kinds of violence, including domestic violence, was in fact a public health crisis. With that in mind, it was then very easy for me to make this transition from public health and what I had known and been doing into this important work in domestic violence prevention. I say all the time that domestic violence prevention is important and is not being given the support and attention that it needs. And we need to do a lot more in that field. Anyway, I joined the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace in late 2009, early 2010. And I was with the organization then from until about mid 2012, when I left the city and moved to New Mexico. One of the things that I was pleased with before leaving here, however, was that in addition to doing group facilitation, I was doing community outreach, community relations, and worked with several of the local police precincts and community organizations, bringing them together and helping to facilitate ongoing dialogue around domestic violence, and helping to find, as many ways as possible to raise the bar on educating communities, as well as educating the police about domestic violence and about the importance of doing whatever we could to prevent domestic violence. Happily, I understand that many of those programs and services are still going on in police precincts around the city. We need more of that, and we need to do everything we possibly can to help make those kinds of efforts far more effective than maybe they are at this point. During the time that I was in New Mexico, one of the things that I found was alarming, but not unusual to the state of New Mexico, was that there's a very tepid kind of response to domestic violence there, at the legislative level, at the law enforcement level. And yet there's some very committed and dedicated people working to do everything they possibly can to help address the issues and the challenges of DV in that state. But I turned a lot of my attention to juvenile justice court diversion programs, became certified as a restorative justice counselor and facilitator, and a conflict mediation counselor, and helped to establish the Restorative Justice Center, the only one that's in Albuquerque at this point. Returning to Chicago 10 years later, I am happily back at the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. And my new role is as Associate Director, but I still facilitate groups in addition to all the other administrative duties that I now have. But the work continues, and the challenges are still there. And I just invite people to begin to look at and sign on to the prevention work. I can't say that enough. Thank you.
You know, I just want to add that I don't think people think about that this is prevention work. This is truly prevention work, because I mean, I was just talking to a colleague in another state a couple of days ago, and, you know, I was hearing about the man who had actually, they had had 7 women in the shelter program, and the same man had been the person who had harmed all 7 women. People go on to harm other people without some intervention. And so truly working with those who harm is about preventing future intimate partner violence. Is something that we really need to recognize, that, you know, we have to be working together in a real coordinated community response with victim service programs, with the criminal justice system, with the community, you know, with other social service agencies, and with programs such as ours, in a really committed way that says, you know, it's only as we work together. It's not one single, you know, program over here doing their thing and another over here. It's really our commitment and our collaboration together that we're going to address this problem. And so I think that I just really want to echo what you were saying, Jim, and that, you know, about the importance of prevention.
Sure. Thanks for that, Christine. And I just, you know, just to add, you know, I mean, in so many ways, we just have to come to terms with the reality that the prevention work that we do is in fact victim services. It really is, and maybe we can explore that more as we discuss this, but it's victim services. It's frontline victim services work. Thank
You know, you're speaking my language, Jim, when you talk about the public health approach. That's my background as well. And I agree with Christine that not only is this sort of, tertiary or the interventions that prevent future recurrences with those who have committed harm, but also, and I know later on I'm going to ask Terry to tell her story of how those who have committed harm, who change their ways, and are role models or parents or older, siblings, when they change their ways, that does have an impact, that does have influence on younger people whom we hope will learn other ways of engaging, and their expectations of what is truly appropriate, what consent looks like, what it means to have equal strength and power in a relationship, and that no, indeed, I can't own another person, I can't control them, and it is not all right for me to control them. And so anyway, I agree with you that it is prevention in not only the people who engage in the intervention, in the partner abuse intervention groups, but also hopefully the people whom they influence. So, Christine, if so, say Apna Ghar has, a survivor of domestic violence who comes to us, and they're the person who's harmed them. Uh, um, Either the client who comes to us, who's the survivor, wants that person to be compelled to engage in abuse intervention, or wants to engage in abuse intervention, or maybe the person who's harmed them says, well, what can I do? How can I change my ways? Or, we know that sometimes there might be another agency or another outside child protective services that says, no, this is going to happen. So, Christine, if Apna Ghar said, okay, this person should contact the person who's harming you, should contact the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. Could you kind of tell us how you would talk to that person, how you'd explain to them what your model is, and what they should expect as a participant?
Yes, I think generally people call our program because they have been mandated in some way. We don't have a large number of non-voluntary, voluntary program participants. And so either, as you said, child protective services, child welfare organizations, it's a part of their treatment plan because there's been a history of intimate partner violence that's affected the children and obviously the parents, or it's, criminal court, civil court, it's the Department of Corrections, parole, it's the sheriff's office, it could be any number of people who are mandating individuals to come. And so, we really just talk about, they talk with our client intake coordinators about, the process. The process is one that we complete a phone intake about, how many weeks the program is. It's a 24-week, 2 hours per week group intervention with one individual session at the midpoint, with the purpose of at that midpoint to really be able to work with them to assess what have they learned, where do they, what else is still there for them to grasp. But we also speak to initially getting them scheduled for an assessment. So they call, they have a phone intake. We tell them that the process is first an assessment to make sure that they meet the criteria for our program and that this is the best place for them to be. After we assess and we determine that, yes, they have, that there's been a pattern of domestic violence, of intimate partner abuse. And that, we talked about that earlier, that could be physical violence, but often it only takes one time for there to be physical violence in a relationship. And then after that, it's emotional, it's financial, it's verbal, it's the look that says, do you remember that I did this before and I could do it again? It's the hand on the wall in a certain way that says, remember. So, we really do talk about the fact that that assessment is really important for us to look for a pattern and whether or not it's not just that one incident. And we collect information about the individual's substance use, mental health, family of origin, history of trauma, history of, their understanding of their strengths, what strengths they think that they have that they can bring to the program to address the issues that are coming before them, and other needs that they may have. We think that it's really important that we collect information and give them referrals for other needs. And I think that's one way that we're different than a lot of programs, because we have a more holistic approach that we have to really serve the whole person. We can't have somebody, sitting in group, who has a toothache and they haven't seen a dentist in a year.
Right.
That's just not good. That's not going to work, right? Or somebody who's homeless, we need to really recognize that that's also a piece of what we need to do, is to really help people in those kinds of circumstances. And of course, we know that can be very challenging in terms of resources, especially in the city of Chicago and Cook County, trying to find housing for people. But, think about it. Many people have an order of protection. They've harmed their partner. They have to leave the home. Where are they going? Do they have a resource to go to? So those are all challenges that we're facing. But we talk with them about those challenges. And then if they do meet the criteria, they come into an orientation group where they hear more about sort of how the group runs, what the expectations are. They have an agreement, a participation agreement that they sign, and they understand what will happen under certain circumstances. We have sliding scale fees. Many of the individuals in our program are under contracts where, child welfare or others are subsidizing their participation. But for those who aren't being subsidized, we have sliding scale fees that usually can go down to $5 or even less sometimes. But we also recognize that for some people coming in, they're not really ready. They come into group, they're not ready. We see that they're really, saying, I don't belong here. We hear that a lot in the first 3 or 4 or 5 weeks of group. And sometimes they're so vociferous in their saying that they don't belong here that it's toxic to the group. So we take them out and we work with them individually to talk through what's going on, to really give them an opportunity to tell their story more fully. And that's been we found that's been very helpful in a number of situations. I mean, I can't put a percentage on that. Terry might be able to, but I remember a number of them where people were able to go back into the group after 3 or 4 or 5 sessions. And some people actually became leaders. They were leaders in the group afterwards. It takes, sometimes it takes us to be innovative. We can't just say, oh, group is the only way. Sometimes we think, how do we have group and some individual support and some case management? So I think that we also, after people finish, we have an aftercare group. We really encourage people to continue on, to come to group, to call. They can come back to their original group. There's no fee. The whole idea is that this is a safe place for you to come back to. We want to help you. We recognize you can't make these kind of changes overnight. The research is really clear that making a behavioral change like this takes time and support of family. Actually, my colleague, my co-founder, Charlie Stoops, and I and another colleague did I think it was 17 qualitative interviews with individuals who had successfully finished the program, because we wanted to understand what helped them finish the program. Well, what do you think the answer was? The answer was there was one person who believed in them and really wanted them to finish because they knew it was going to help them, and it was going to help their children, and it was going to help their family. And usually, not always, but usually it was a woman in their lives. It was their auntie. It was their mom. It was their grandmother. It was their probation officer. It was the female facilitator in our group. Occasionally it was a man, but almost always it was a woman who was saying, sometimes it was their new partner or their previous partner who was saying, I'm glad you're doing that. So, it's really a process. We really see our model as one of being a continuum of services. And with additional funding, which we hope we will get in the near future, we're looking to add some additional aftercare services like couples groups for those who are still together or with new partners, so that they can talk about how they're going to be able to deal with conflict. I mean, every relationship has conflict, right? Violence has been normalized. So if you've learned all these years that, the way to handle a situation is to be abusive, it's not just the people in our program that do that or have done that. So we know that we need to work with others to really understand it. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting is that we've heard from some people that their use of power and control in relationships is almost addictive. It's like that's a way that they can have power when they don't feel they have any power in their lives. And so it has a quality to it that they really have to work on to understand that addiction, that escalation, even though it's only a short period of power and control, right? So I think those are other features of our program that we're really working to understand and more fully address, as well as understanding for men of color, especially Black men, how racial discrimination, and all that goes with that oppression and lack of power in our society is associated. There's some more research that's been recently coming out about that relationship. So there's a lot more for us to learn, and we're trying our best to learn it and to integrate that in how we work with people in the program. But I think the last thing I'd like to say before I turn this over to Terry, who's got a lot more to say because she's doing it on a day-to-day basis, she's doing the work. I unfortunately have all that administrative stuff that I also have to do, is that we recognize that so many of the individuals who come into our program, that there are multifaceted reasons why they have made this choice to harm another person. We recognize, when I look at the assessments, person after person, histories of trauma in terms of child abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence in their family, community violence, involvement in community violence, and also the messages that men get about stuffing their feelings, right? Their feelings, what do you do with all of that stuff? And then what happens, when you're not sure how to handle it anymore? So we recognize that we have to really hold people accountable, but we also have to demonstrate empathy and compassion for them as human beings.
They have to go hand in hand. So, my understanding is that, folks who, are referred to you and are interviewed and found to be, an appropriate, a good candidate for, and, for the program, the partner abuse intervention program model is it 26 weeks of weekly 2-hour meetings?
It's actually 24 weeks of minimum, a minimum of 24 weeks, and then a 1 hour of individual at the midpoint, plus the comprehensive assessment and an orientation. So I guess technically it is a 26 group because we have a group orientation.
And so my, and I understand this partner abuse intervention program, the model, it's usually co-facilitated.
Yes. We try to have most of the groups co-facilitated by a male and female counselor, but a few of our groups are facilitated by 2 female counselors. Mm-hmm. The Illinois domestic violence protocol does allow for 2 female facilitators, in addition to, if in the event that you need to be able to do that because you don't have enough male staff. I mean, that's another issue in doing this work, is trying to find men who are willing to do this work. We actually interviewed how many people recently?
Oh, it must have been at least a dozen.
Yeah. And they decided they didn't want to, weren't interested in learning how to do this.
This is what we need to do, is we need to get out there and talk to more people, because I know that you've gotten this request and we've gotten the request of, can you do abuse intervention groups in other languages? Can you do abuse intervention groups with that address some of the cultural factors and and some of those other people who understand the context of shared heritage, shared histories, shared historical traumas,
Mm-hmm.
All of that. And so what we are hoping is that we can get more bilingual, bicultural folks out there get the training, to get the 40-hour domestic violence training, and then the 20-hour PAPE training, the partner abuse intervention program training, so that they can also lead groups and hopefully learn from all of you, from all of the lessons you've learned. And I know, over these years, Mike Feinerman and now Terry have come in from the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace and always are just very, very popular, well-received speakers in our 40-hour training. And I learn something every time I listen to them. And Terry, I know that one of the things that's always been really interesting for us is to hear from you in terms of assumptions you came in with, and just lessons you've learned in doing this work over all of these years.
One is the recognition that oftentimes a lot of it, as Christine mentioned earlier, is the idea that so many of the men that come to our programs are victims themselves. Victims of, again, oppression, victims of, poor education, substance abuse, just victimized by systems, and that their response is basically survival. They're survival mode. A lot of the men that come into our program, community violence, plagues. I can remember a time when one of our participants came in, and he was pretty quiet anyway, but on this particular day, he just could not. He just was gone, and had faced the loss of a couple of his dearest friends. And we asked, how do you move on beyond this? We had spent time to really process. One thing that I love about our groups is they're psychoeducational groups, so it's a space for our participants to really share in a safe space their thoughts, their opinions. In fact, it's a part of the program. And so oftentimes what I learned is, in that space, in that time when the participants are able to just share their stories, they get the support from other men. And I've learned that, whereas as a woman, I have my circle of friends that I can sit down and talk to, cry on their shoulders, and get that support, right? And oftentimes men don't have that space. It's, buck up, man up, but here it's a space for vulnerability if needed, support that's here in a non-judgment place. They can share what their thoughts are, share what their true feelings are about places. And we, again, don't judge. We may talk about the actions that they've engaged, their behaviors, the actions, but certainly not judging them. And so that's one thing that I learned, that concept of what the camaraderie that our groups help. Those men support each other in ways that, as a facilitator, without the men, it was not there. If this was just an individual session, I can share my thoughts, but they need that support from other men who've been there, who understand. The open-ended groups help, so that you have various stages of the intervention. So people who are new to the groups are listening to these other men who could say, you know what, I've been here. I remember what it was like to sit in your space day one, day two. But be open. When you have great men in there that are really getting it, when they get it, as I think Christine might have mentioned, or maybe you did, Veronica, the idea that so many people that come into groups, they're not ready. They're not ready. That, I didn't do anything wrong. Because what did they do? They behaved in the ways that was modeled to them. We learn what we live. So if I saw this is the way that it was demonstrated. Now, this doesn't mean that every time you've seen domestic violence in growing up with domestic violence, that you're going to automatically engage in that behavior. But certainly some of these behaviors are normalized.
Absolutely.
Right? They're even sometimes in some circles supported.
Yeah. By family and peers.
By family, by peers, by the media, right? Social media, So she said, what did you do? I hope you knocked in the mouth. Absolutely not. So one of the things that we talk about is the concept of who we can control and who we can change, right? Who do we have, we know that domestic violence is about power and control, right? So a lot of times we've had men who felt like it was their responsibility as men to control their partners, right?
Yeah.
So that's the concept that we talk about, right? that I didn't understand. That it's not, I was very comfortable with that knowledge. But what I knew was not what I was seeing in group, right? That understanding that you can't control anyone but you, or change anyone but you, right? Um, and again, walking into group the first time that I walked in as an intern, you know, not knowing what to expect. So you feel, almost like you think that this person that's engaging in these behaviors is a monster, right? Oh my God, you did something. And you sit in and you look around at people that look like you, look like they can get, look like there's no difference. There's no face of someone who harms, And I think that was something that was new to me. Like, I didn't think about that. You kind of felt like they must be really, really edgy people. And it's going to be really dangerous for me to sit here and engage in this, right? No. And there are people who have incredible strengths and are very creative. They've got all of these wonderful strengths, creativity. A lot of times, I noticed that when we are in groups, this is a great processing space, as I mentioned before. Talented, because sometimes, as you're sitting in the circle, I've noticed that sometimes, and I do it too, just doodle. I'll draw as I'm talking and processing and thinking, right? And I had one of my participants was sitting next to me and he was drawing, talented. Oh my gosh. What he did with his manual. I said, I wish I could really buy that from you. He said, no, I'm going to keep this because this is me. And you could see, as we talked, he would illustrate what we're talking about, conversations, not verbatim writing it, but just if it was about harm, it was like terror in someone's face. Just really, because I don't want to forget this. I want to be able to remember this as I open up my manual and really remember and recall how I felt as I listened to these stories and how I was able to reflect and see what I've done. Because and he told me, he said, I've put fear in someone's face, and I felt good about it because that's what I was supposed to do.
Right.
Job well done, without ever thinking about the impact that it had on my partner.
Right.
That's something that I learned.
Yeah.
Right.
Dr. Deborah Prothero-Stith, who was, in the 90s at Harvard, she was an emergency room physician and was seeing a lot of the violence. And she talked about the utility of violence, that for people who use harm or threats, there's the reward of, if I threaten them or if I give them that look, they will comply and do what I want them to do. Absolutely. So there's that reward.
Yes.
And so what I'm really fascinated about, amongst other things, is how you work with people to get to the point where they're like, well, yeah, it got this person to stay in line and do what I wanted them to do. But now I realize it's just not all right for me to have done that. I mean, I'm amazed to hear about how that change occurs in the groups, in the individual and group work.
A lot of times it's about, again, the relatability and really developing one tool that I use a lot is children. Most of the men in our groups are parents. And the question is, what do you say to your daughter to prepare her for what she should experience, what she may experience as she goes on to engage in relationships?
No, I talk in some of my groups about how important it is, to pay attention to what we do and what we go through on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes, men, if we ask them to come in on a weekly basis and say, how was your week? They may not have a lot that they could share. And I challenge them, there's something that happened during the week that you can relate to that was either satisfying for you or that was challenging for you. And how you decide to either embrace that or change that, is something that you need to begin to think about. Pay attention to what happens to your life on a daily basis. And through that, hopefully, we give them some tools to build some empathy for themselves first and foremost, and then empathy for one another. and begin to put themselves in the, in others' places
Yeah.
and see what they're doing. That uh, that may be harm that they just don't really think about until we give them an opportunity to look back on it. And that's really, so we live in this environment of community violence, and it's there every day, and it translates into so many of the forms of violence. And if you take it home with you, it translates into domestic violence.
Yes.
And so we want to get people to begin to pay attention to and see themselves, in this environment, and look at some alternatives to what they do. I had a young man um, in a group several years ago who lived a very violent life. And he came home one morning. No, yeah, he came home one morning from working overnight, and his partner confronted him because she had learned that he was having affairs with a couple of other women. And they got into this violent confrontation in their apartment. And in the process of doing so, they knocked open the bedroom door where their 5-year-old son slept. And he woke up and he witnessed his father just beating his mother mercilessly. Well, as the police were called and they came in and they were carrying this man out the door, taking him to jail, this 5-year-old son looked up at his father and said, "I hate you, and I'm going to get a gun and kill you." That's the beginning of a learned behavior. That's the beginning of a 5-year-old child beginning to embrace, the violence in a community that he probably lives in and probably grew up in. And so when he was telling this story, he was telling it in such a way that he said, "I get it. I understand, where I'm coming from. I understand where I live. I understand, all the things that need to be changed, and they have to start with me."
It's incredible. I understand that there are those, absolutely those wake up moments when we see the reflection. Apna Ghar has a supervised child visitation program. And as we've begun to change the model and broaden it and do an enhanced visitation model, there is the um, case management now for the non-custodial parent, who's in most cases the father, the person who committed harm, and is estranged from the children somewhat, and and then is having these supervised visits. And I remember one time a father seeing a drawing the child did, and
Mm,
your child draw you as a monster.
yes,
Mhm.
yes, yes,
Oh, that can be the wake-up call.
that's right.
And it's just so fascinating. And I know that one of the things that you have talked about, as I've learned from listening to all of you over the years, the work that you do, is that you've said that there is this restorative justice element in terms of there being this, somewhat of a healing and accountability circle, and examining one's behavior. But I understand that also you've said that there's some people for whom this is the first time they really fully get to tell their story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we
Especially-
need to hear.
And
We
I
do.
think that speaks also to those who are really not wanting to engage early on, that I talked about, that some people need more time than one session to tell their story,
Oh,
their
absolutely.
story of their own abuse, and recognizing all of the emotions that are associated with their abuse. Some of the questions that we ask in group, especially Terry was talking about that, when with regards to them relating to their children, but sometimes that comes first from asking them about their own childhood and
Right.
their own experiences, and then having them, sort of draw the bridge to what's going on with their own children. That can very much be that aha moment for them as they examine what happened to them, where they learned the belief. Where did you get that belief? You said that you grew up with this is how men in your family act, or like, where did you learn that? So
Yeah.
that's a piece of what they have to think about is, where did that come from that I thought I needed to control, and that all of my needs should come first and she should do what I want her to do. Where did you learn that? And how does it work for you? Really, what is it like, to know that you have to control somebody like that in order to get something from them? What would it be like if they were giving to you voluntarily
Mm.
because they wanted to, and because you were in this equal relationship where you were allies against the world in terms of, the things that Jim was talking about, right? The violence in the communities and everything else that's going on. What would that mean? What if you don't really have to be the one that's solely responsible for the financial aspect or for some other aspect? What if that's shared?
Mhm.
So, how do you lose out? That whole sense,
Mm.
how do you lose out?
It's incredible. I know that, Jim, especially hearing about your experience in restorative justice and the work that you were doing in New Mexico. I believe it was in Utah where an experiment was done where they had one group that was doing abuse intervention, a group of people who had committed harm in their relationships, and another group that was also doing was doing abuse intervention, but there was also a restorative justice element that was added to the intervention, and that the outcomes were much stronger for the people that did abuse intervention and some sort of restorative justice element where they were, whether it was, hearing indirectly or directly from the person they'd harmed, and where they had to own up not to just other people who committed harm, but to their peers, to their community. This is what I did. And there was that accountability to their larger circle.
Yeah. There's a lot of merit to that approach, but it's also one that has to be approached carefully
Mm.
because it's almost like couples counseling in an uncontrolled environment, I think. I can't stress how careful we have to be with that, but it can be very, very effective when you have someone who sees themselves in relationship to the person that they've harmed, and also in relationship to the community, and how that harm, can transfer to an even larger environment. And so I think that those kinds of things have to be taken into consideration. But you have to move somebody, down the road a bit so that they begin to understand that. Because as Christine mentioned, far too many, people come into our groups, completely resistant, completely in denial, and there's not much that you can tell them. And what happens through the socialization that goes on in the group, is that they hear from other people. They hear from people who've been there longer than them. I was thinking as you all were talking about the most violent incident report that happens around the 16th week in a group, where people actually share, and we help them prepare those most violent incident reports, and they present them to the entire group. And sometimes the stories can be so riveting, that people who are newer in the group, people who have been there for a long time, are actually moved by this information because they can relate to it themselves. And it's at that point, I think, when we can talk about, a restorative justice kind of model, because someone's come to terms, with the fact that, yes, I've done harm, and I'm ready to talk about it, with people that I have in fact harmed. So it requires a very careful approach, but it can be very effective.
And my understanding is that, sometimes, the survivor chooses whether or not they will directly address the person who's harmed them, or if, their statement about this is what you did and this is how I've experienced it and this is what it's doing to me day to day might be, read to them or told by another person or something, but that there's still that element of you're going to hear the impact of what you did, but the person has chosen not to speak to you directly, for
Absolutely, absolutely, because the harm can, I was, the harm can be so deep and so long lasting that it's very difficult for people to come back from it, to the point that they are able to sit down and confront their abuser at any time in the near future.
and
Yeah,
they have to.
difficult.
One of the things that you're saying that also I think is so fascinating is I learned years ago from a woman who did research on peer mediation and gender. And
Mm,
she said, peer mediation, and correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm not a clinician, and my understanding is also couples counseling is premised on two equal beings coming together to talk, listen, and reach an agreement. And she said, girls, when they get into conflicts, don't they don't feel equal because they don't see themselves as powerful
mhm,
and they feel deficient in power. And then we also know, of course, that it is so dangerous to try to do traditional couples counseling in an abusive situation because it can be so traumatizing, and because the person who's committed harm, there can be various manipulations and all of that. But what you're proposing in terms of your aftercare couples
mhm.
counseling, I know is a totally different thing.
Yes.
I mean, how do you envision that working? And could you explain to folks who aren't familiar what the difference would be between Center for Advancing Domestic Peace aftercare couples intervention versus well-intentioned but ill-informed couples counseling therapist trying to counsel, trying to get an abusive person and the person they're harming, trying to work with them in
Yes,
traditional couples counseling?
very.
Yeah. Well, of course, what we would do first is really have a meeting with both parties to make sure that and we would have certain criteria about what would be happening, and what would happen if, there was a violation of sort of the agreements that would be outlined, and that to make sure that both people wanted to do it, that the person who had with the survivor, and there will be some who are the survivors, but there will be some who are new partners. So, it would be a combination of those that I would anticipate. I think that the last I looked, about 17 to 20% of the men are still with the individual that they harmed.
Mm.
And then there's at least another 20 to 30% who are in new relationships. So we really envision that this would be a group too. We really think that the fact that it would be group couples counseling, maybe 4 to 5 couples working together to
Wow.
talk through the same kinds of issues about how do you deal with conflict, what do you do to intervene, about how you find yourself escalating, about timeout. So everybody's sort of on the same page, the men hearing about the women's experience, the women hearing about the men's experience. I remember reading from Wesley University about a group years ago where there was a group like this that was not with men who had been men and women where there had necessarily been abuse. But they talked about how the men and the women were there, and the women were waiting breathlessly to hear what the men had to say, because the men don't speak about their feelings. And so they were just like, finally, we're going to get to hear, you know.
Wow.
So, you know, so we really do envision this being a group, you know, because we think groups work, you know, and we've seen that groups work, and we think this would be a good way. And we think that offers some protection too for the participants to
Ah,
be in a group format versus
Right.
just, you know, one-on-one, you know, two people working together. That doesn't mean we might not take a couple out if we feel there's a need for additional work. I
Sure,
think
sure.
that we've learned enough about that we would recognize that could potentially be be helpful. You know, Gottman, who's done a lot of research on couples work, you know, has really done some work with couples where there's mild to moderate, however you define that. You know, that's something we could debate, right? I think with the work that we do, but you know, that where there has been quite a bit of success. So we wouldn't be talking about the really extreme abuse, physical abuse, strangulation, etc. That would not be. And of course, we would be figuring out, you know, we're being very careful about our criteria for people who would come in. But we think that doing a group like this is really about prevention too.
Yeah.
Again, it gets back to that it takes time to make a behavioral change. And if both partners are on the same page and have heard the same thing and are making agreements together, and they're hearing from other couples about what the challenges are about being in a relationship, that's going to help them.
Mm.
So,
And
you know,
it's
and
also
most of the people in our group, you know, in our program can't afford couples. That's sort
Right.
of like
Yes.
couples work. I mean, I think, and we've heard it from some of the men asking for, would that be something that you could offer? So, and we have women saying, you know, I really want to, well, they're often asking at the beginning that they want to do couples work, but we've heard of women asking afterwards. And I, you know, when I had a private practice doing this work, I did do some work with couples after he had finished the program.
and it's actually, again, continued support. You
Yeah.
know, a lot of times when our participants leave our program, and even if they come in for aftercare services with us, they still they're going back out into that relationship, or even if it's a new relationship, and they're honest about their experiences, right? And so almost sometimes they feel like, and they've talked about how sometimes their partners will try to, like, for lack of a better word, poke the bear to see if, did you really change?
Right.
You know, and they'll talk about that, you know, and my question is, you know, well, did you change? You can't control what she says, you can control your actions. What's your response going to be, right? And still practicing those skills. And you know, one of my favorite lines is, go back to what you already know. You already know the answers to what you're asking me, you know. And so the support, I think the idea of the couples work, it gives their partners a chance to see exactly what it is
Uh-oh.
that they're learning. They see it from their experiences of being out, but then really hearing those skill sets for themselves and how they can process and engage and learn, you know. Because again, a lot of times we're kind of shaped by our experiences, you
Yeah.
know, and so maybe their partners don't necessarily know what a healthy relationship looks like, you know, and so it's easy to say, oh, that's not the way you really are. Let's see if this really is working. So I think that couples work would really be a chance to really grow that skill set.
Yeah.
Something that I think is, if I'm just thinking again, the idea of when our participants come into group, you know, we all have stories that we would prefer not to be read aloud, chapters of our lives that we would prefer not to be read aloud. And so that strength to come in and share that. And each time that they say it, you know, because we kind of go over this every time someone new comes into group. Okay, now what happened? What was your story, right? We get a little more detail, a little more comfort in really being able to share. Because again, there's that fear of being judged. There's that fear, you know, of really expressing yourself. And again, they don't know anyone. There's no comfort there. So
Right,
again, it's
right.
a process, and that process grows. And hopefully with the couples work, that's encouragement for that relationship. Not that we're working on keeping the relationship together, but we're looking forward to making sure that people are safe and engaging in safe ways.
Providing with some tools.
Absolutely.
Right, right.
Fighting with some tools. Yeah. We're not taught. We're not taught how to have conflict
No, we're not.
in a,
We're not.
safe or respectful or productive way.
Right.
Now that's incredible. That's I mean that's I think that's really promising, and I'm praying that you're all going to get the support to do that work and to teach us, what you're learning from it. And Jim, from one public health geek to another, one of the things that we one of the ways that I want to see us approaching using a public health approach to this is we're taught, and the statistic we give is that in at least one study 33% of men who had seen usually it was their father abused their mother or stepmother, they're up to be physically violent in their relationships, but 67% exposed to that same trauma do not. And what I want us to do in really good public health fashion is to say, what were the elements present in the 67%, and how can we replicate that? Was it caring
Absolutely.
adult? Was it spiritual growth? Was it peers who are like, no, that's not okay? What were the elements there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how do we succeed at then exposing more men
Yes.
to whatever those contributing elements may have been, that gives them a fighting chance, if you will.
Yeah. Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, this is so exciting, and we want more and more people to learn from you and to hear your insights and to understand what it means when a person who has done something wrong, even if they don't see it as wrong, but when they get a chance to be heard and to be coming back week after week to people who believe in them and who are like, I'm going to hear you and I'm going to listen to you, and I believe you can change because I've seen many others change in this same process. That's powerful. And I understand that not all programs have the success rate that you all do. The Center for Advancing Domestic Peace, my understanding is that you've got a very good percentage of people who don't, as far as recommit or
Motivate.
yeah.
Yeah. We don't have any longitudinal studies, but I do think that the fact that we have about a 65% completion rate speaks to the research that says completion.
Yes.
It is about completing a program that decreases recidivism. But of course, we know that, again, we want to be really clear that just because you don't come before the courts again with another
Right.
domestic violence doesn't mean that you're still not being emotionally or verbally abusive. We know that, think about all the people trying to quit smoking, how long it takes to make that kind of a behavioral change. Let's just be honest that it takes time. It takes support. I remember before COVID, it was about 6 months before COVID, and this young man came into the office. He was really in a panic that he needed to talk to somebody. And he said, yeah, I'm so glad you're still here. I was in the program like five years ago, but I feel like I'm going to hurt somebody. He came because he was afraid he was going to hurt somebody, and he knew this was a safe place to come to figure out what was going on. We don't want men who, I still remember this young man who was, in our group when I was facilitating groups, and he talked about, what he would do is with his emotions was when he felt like he had to cry, he would go into the bathroom and cry. So nobody would see him be that vulnerable, but men need to feel like they can cry.
Oh, yeah.
and do it in front of their peers and in front of their partner and be accepted. And, you know, we've got to change that perception in our society that that's not being manly, right?
Oh,
Right.
You know?
Well, that kind of speaks to Tony Porter, in the man
Yes.
box,
Breaking out of the
right?
man box.
yes.
Right. That's right. Um, but as we know that man box is often supported by women,
Yes.
Mhm.
stay in, I need you to be strong, and how can, and who's to say that um sharing your emotions makes you weak, right? And that's something that again goes back to how couples work could really be beneficial, definitely.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
learning to unlearn
Mhm.
the negative and the problematic behaviors, and learning to stop the victim blaming. I know that, one of the things that we do in our 40-hour trainings is we say, look, the question most often asked is, why did they stay? I would never stand for that. Why are they staying? I said, we say to them, we need you to flip the script and ask, what were all the messages that this person received that made them think it was okay to harm, to control, to manipulate, to threaten, to surveil, and to punish, and think they had the right to punish their partner or their ex-partner. And that whole, like, it takes a village to create
Yes.
an abusive person.
That's right.
We
That's
don't
right.
Think about all the
know
men.
abusing. Pardon me?
Think about all the men who know that another man has been harming his partner and they haven't said anything to them.
Mm.
Yeah, that code.
There's that code. Other men know.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually, that just reminded me of another situation where a student had come to me and said that his good friend was abusing women. And he said, well, I decided that what I would do is just not have him be my friend anymore. So that was his solution. That
But
Doesn't help the women.
but what bothers me is that's their business, as in what happens under this roof
Yes.
Yeah.
remains here, right? But it does, it impacts everybody. It impacts
Right.
surely impacts the children. It impacts the person who's been harmed. There are children who are no longer just not witnesses, but they're victims themselves. It impacts the community. It impacts, family, friends, everybody. And but it's still that's still that attitude of that's their business prevails. It's amazing,
And it's perpetuating the behavior.
It
Yes.
does. It
It's
does.
perpetuating the behavior. And that's and yeah. And we talk about this, particularly when men are coming close to finishing a group. We try to engage them in conversations, talk about what will you do? What do you see yourself doing? Or how do you feel about having a conversation with someone, that you witness is doing harm, and it's a difficult conversation for a lot of people, but it's a conversation that we have to have, we just have to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because there
And
is that peer, that impact of, like, what if society says nothing to me, if society looks the other way, then
It must be okay.
yeah. And
Might be
modeling
silence.
a moment of personal accountability. I said something earlier that I need to correct, and that is I was talking about giving people a fighting chance. No, we don't want to give anybody a fighting anything. What we want to do is we want to open up opportunities,
yes,
positive opportunities. So I just wanted to correct myself on that.
appreciate that.
Because
Yeah.
language
We have to
means so
model
much
our own
that it means
accountability.
something. Yeah, it means language means something.
It does.
Yeah.
It
Does.
means
It really
something,
does.
and we just, we have to really recognize language. There's so many other words that we can use. And just language,
Mhm. Mhm.
We have so
Yeah.
many violent parts to our language and sayings and phrases that we use, you know.
And we emphasize that in group too.
Yeah, we do.
Good.
Yeah, on a
Oh.
regular basis, right? That
Yes.
we haven't really examined what that means and what, how we sort of grow up with that. What is that? Killing a bird? Killing a
Killing
Right.
birds with
I
two
was
stones.
told that that a group that in a conflict resolution group or some sort of peace studies group, they came up with, instead of killing two birds with one stone, they say housing two birds with one nest.
There you go.
Come up
Yeah.
with these alternative phrases, and I love that. I'm like,
I
yes,
do. That's great.
That is really
Yeah.
nice.
isn't that lovely?
Housing two birds with one
Mhm.
nest
Housing
like
two birds
that.
with one nest.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Terry, I know that you have also, taught us and talked to us about how all of you at Centers for Advancing Domestic Peace also work with a lot of women who've committed harm.
Yes, yes. We have actually three women's groups, two English speaking groups and one Spanish speaking group for women who have engaged in intimate partner harm. And oftentimes it's more about mutual couples violence. You know, it could be sick and tired of being sick and tired. Or this is and really it's almost like those experiences in one relationship have traveled. So now I'm in this new relationship, and so before I can be harmed, I'm gonna harm.
Yeah.
The one thing about the women, they're pretty accountable. Accountability in terms of this is what I did. And it's almost again empowering themselves so that they don't have to feel small. They were small in this relationship, so now I'm aggressive. I can be aggressive because I don't want to be harmed anymore. And so the work that we do with the women is about really building self-esteem, giving options and choices. Recognizing your strengths so that you can channel this energy in other ways, right? Recognizing that, I think we have, one thing that I like about this program is the homework piece, really, in terms of really, what are you learning about domestic violence as you sit here, right? And with the recognition that you're here. And sometimes they feel like it's so unfair that I'm here because there were things that happened to me before. They didn't have the consequences, just like men will say those same excuses. And we talk about really building awareness, self-awareness, being
Yes.
safe, and recognizing that choices that you have, other options that you might have, so that you're not in this situation anymore, that you can find other methods of, again, conflict resolution, or other methods about being safe in your relationship, and your partner needing to feel safe in the relationship, trust, really building them up so that they don't have to make these decisions that they're making. And I can remember one particular person that came in, and she did her final self-evaluation, and she was sharing, I have resources, I have strengths, I don't have to resort to being in relationships that are unhealthy because I don't see other ways.
Yeah.
One thing I like about the women's groups also is the resources. They bring in resources and talk about them. It's not, these are things that are working for me. What is working for you? How can we work for,
Oh yeah, shared strategy.
child ringing and strategizing and things like that, in terms of, I can be better. I don't have to be here, and I have to be better. A lot, unfortunately, and when we talk about parenting in groups for with the men's groups, but unfortunately, sometimes in relationships that we have with the women's groups, they don't have the luxury of co-parenting, so they're really responsible for child rearing, child raising, and the consequences they face. That, again, so many women that they're referred to our program are coming from child welfare agencies. I have to be here to get my child back.
Yeah.
So they've got a lot at stake, in addition to dealing with the shame and the guilt around losing your children because of a relationship. And again, we feel like, my child, this is my right to have my child, right? But yeah, we want you to have your child, but we need your child to be safe in this relationships that you have, or safe at home with you too, you
Yeah.
know.
One of the things that there's a researcher in Israel in a social work program who's done research on women who are victims of domestic violence who abuse their own children. And they said one of the hardest or most challenging situations to work with is a woman who had a difficult relationship with her mother and who was abused by her mother and continues as an adult to have a problematic relationship with her mother. That folks, women in that situation, ending their abusive behavior of their children is especially challenging, because my understanding of the research that looking at all of this is that for mothers who are survivors of domestic violence who also abuse or neglect their children, for many of them the abuse and neglect ends or greatly diminishes once they're out of an abusive relationship, once they're out of an abusive situation. But for some of those folks, yeah, we know that if there's that issue of the problematic relationship with the mother, it's especially challenging. So, I mean, those are just some of the many things, because there's a lot more to talk about in our in future panel sessions. This has been amazing. I mean, you all, there's so much to learn, and it's very exciting to hear about all the great potential out there, all the work that you could do given support. And
Time, opportunity, and space. Absolutely.
Yes.
absolutely. And we hope for more. And you got to let us know. And that's one of the things. Let's let us know what we can do to advocate for you getting the support you need to try these programs that are so desperately needed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, Christine, you're on mute.
Say that we really, I think that one of the areas that I'd really like us to see where we could do more work is just really recognizing that, so many women are involved in addressing this issue, but this is a men's issue. And we're not seeing men coming up and saying, we need to be part of this solution. We are part of the problem and we need to be here. And we're not seeing it. And I think that, like when I look at the social work schools and there's one man in the social work class, when there's, it's so hard to recruit men to be in our programs, but whether it's in victim services or in partner abuse intervention. I mean, there's just a lack of accountability, if you will, I think, on the part of men in terms of them recognizing this isn't going to change without their support. We really need them at the table.
Absolutely. We got to go out and find them. And
We do.
And my understanding is folks like Valor US out in the out in California, they've learned that they really have to just hand over the work in communities and to folks who can take these interventions and the challenges and the dialogues and run them themselves in their own communities based in the shared lived experience. And so that's what we're, and we hope the folks who watch this will also have suggestions for future topics and future guests for us to talk to. But anyway, we know that there's some really interesting work that is being done, and we do have to see it done differently. We have to be willing to look at changes to the models we're using.
Well, maybe there's not one model that fits everybody either. So we need to be really careful about talking about models without talking about that there's not one that's going to fit for everyone. In fact, maybe the more that there's a way to work with people, that we bring in whatever it is that they need in order to support them in their change process. So that could be restorative justice in addition, that can be couples work at the end, that can be, whatever, but we have to be willing to not be so like we can only do it this way, you know?
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. And we're looking forward to seeing the results of and the outcomes of the work that you're proposing to do. I mean, that sounds incredible. And well, I am so grateful that there are folks like you out doing the work that you're doing. And I'm so grateful for the Center for Advancing Domestic Peace. And
Thank
and
you.
we're just really glad to finally be having these dialogues that, you know, we hope will spur a lot more interest and support for your work.
Well, we appreciate you too.
We appreciate the
so much for this
opportunity.
opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you
Well-
for this opportunity to just talk about it and, you know,
Yes.
bring more to the community and the public about what we're doing.
You know, thank you. And I'm just grateful. Terry reached out a couple months ago and said, Domestic Violence Awareness Month is coming up. Let's partner.
Let's do it.
You did.
Let's do it.
And so we need to see us all working together more. So thank you for this invite, Terry. This
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
we love partnering with all of you, and we
Absolutely.
look forward to a lot more future dialogues.
For
Great.
sure. For sure.
Absolutely.
Radhika, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Have a wonderful, restful weekend.
You too.
And you
You
too.
You too.
All right.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.
You too. Good night.
Night.